Good morning. Welcome. My name is Bill Hendricks. I'm the Executive Director for Christian Leadership at the Hendricks Center. And I'm so glad to see all of you here today. Before we dive into our topic, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items with you. If you have something that resembles this or that can make noise, could you please silence it or else just turn it off if you don't mind? We'd rather not disturb the conversation. Also, at the breaks, if you're looking for a restroom, there's a couple of restrooms right across the hall here, and then, of course, there's more upstairs on the second floor if those get a little overcrowded. Now, our schedule today, we don't have any workshops. We just have 4 plenary sessions, 2 this morning, 2 this afternoon, and, of course, lunch in the middle. We will take a break between the first session and the second session, and likewise between the third and the fourth sessions. But with no workshops, that means that you'll want to take particular opportunity at the breaks and at lunch to debrief with others about the things that you're hearing and your reactions to the presentations. And it also means that you'll want to take advantage of our texting system by which we want you to send in questions that our panelists and presenters can speak into, so that we can feed them to the speakers so they can try to cover the areas you most want addressed. And also, out in the room 110 here at the breaks and at lunch, there's a room of exhibits. We'd invite you to go out there. There's some resources related to the topic and so forth. And then finally, you know, a day like today, when we deal with this difficult subject, you know, that may activate some feelings for some of you. You may have been through some difficult circumstances related to the very thing that we're talking about. And if you find yourself, you know, needing someone to talk to, a bit distressed or anxious or whatever, we actually have some counselors here at the seminary led by Kelly Cheatham, and they're sort of on standby, if you will, just to be available so that we're sensitive to anybody's needs along those lines. Late in the Advent season of 2017, 140 prominent Christian women released a statement entitled #Silence is not spiritual. The statement was a response to a growing number of incidents within the evangelical body of Christ in which charges of sexual misconduct had been brought forward by women, but they had been ignored. Quote, "This moment in history is ours to steward," the women wrote. "We are calling churches, particularly those in the stream of the Christian faith, evangelical churches, to end the silence and stop all participation in violence against women. We call our pastors, our elders, and our parishioners who have been silent to speak up and stand up for all who experience abuse. There is no institution with greater capacity to create protected spaces for healing and restoration for survivors, as well as confession, repentance, and rehabilitation for perpetrators," end quote. As our team at the Hendricks Center reflected on these matters, we asked ourselves, what is our best role in stewarding this historic moment? In addition to being a theological moment, it is also a pastoral moment. And we discerned that there are 4 dimensions of pastoral care that need to be addressed. First, of course, is care for the woman who comes forward with accusations of sexual impropriety by a leader at her church or at a Christian ministry. But also care for the person accused of sexual impropriety. And then thirdly, care for the congregation or organization where this situation unfolds, which includes the staff and the other leaders who work there. And then finally, a 4th care for the local church or Christian ministry itself as an institution. Most congregations and parachurch ministries, after all, are not only organic communities, but legal entities organized as 501c3 or corporations that operate under the laws of the state. Now, obviously, 4 separate conferences could easily be devoted to the respective needs of each of these 4 parties. However, we only get to do 1 conference today. There's a growing number of initiatives now in play to serve women who have come forward, and to some extent, there are also efforts to deal with the perpetrators of sexual sins. So the Hendricks Center decided that our best use today would be to help those who lead churches and Christian ministries think through how they can best care for their people and their institutions in the midst of hearing from both the accused and the accuser. In framing up the day in this way, however, we don't want to lose sight of the sobering fact that when a woman comes forward to bring charges of sexual harassment, abuse, or violence, that's a very serious matter, and it needs to be taken seriously. She needs to be taken seriously first and foremost because she is a person made in the image of God. And God commands us to hear her justly and treat her justly. But also because the research shows that she is most likely telling the truth. Over the past 10 years, quite a few studies have been conducted to determine how often a woman's accusations have proven true and how often they have proven false. The consistent answer is that on the high side, only 10% of claims turn out to be false. And the more likely figure is between 7 to 8%, with some studies showing even less. In other words, 90% of the time or more when a woman comes forward, something is up and needs to be investigated. The lesson for the church is no matter what the outcome turns out to be, a woman who comes forward needs to be taken seriously. So we think today's conference can help church leaders take this matter seriously by thinking through ahead of time what you and your church's response will be when a woman comes forward. We want you to be proactive because we're going to hear a consistent theme today, and it's admittedly a sobering theme. The core of that theme is that churches and Christian organizations need to develop a strategy ahead of time for handling sexual misconduct. The sobering part is that even with a robust strategy, there's hardly any way of handling such a thing well. But it's guaranteed that an unprepared church or ministry will respond to accusations of sexual impropriety very poorly and may well do further harm to all concerned. So with that in mind, we want to begin our first session today with Vonda Dyer and her husband, Scott Dyer. Vonda is a singer, worship leader, teacher, and writer. She is also the Senior Vice President of Creative for Minerva Consulting, a Dallas-based consultancy providing integrated communications solutions for businesses, nonprofits, colleges and universities, industry associations and organizations and events. Vonda was the vocal director at Willow Creek Community Church for 6 years after she had served there 8 years as a volunteer, singing, leading worship, and coaching vocalists. Scott Dyer is the lead pastor of worship and strategic ministries at Bent Tree Bible Fellowship in Carrollton and Frisco. He oversees all the ministries that send Bent Tree's message beyond the walls of its physical campuses. And prior to coming to Bent Tree, he was the worship leader at Willow Creek. On a side note, the Dyers got engaged on the Field of Dreams in Dyersville, Iowa, and they now live in Dallas with their 2 daughters, along with a dog named Ivy Bear. After Scott and Vonda make their remarks, my colleague, Dr. Daryl Bach, Executive Director for Cultural Engagement, will join them to facilitate a time for you to ask your questions. Would you please join me in welcoming Scott and Vonda Dyer?
I must say it is a bit emotional for me to look around this room and see people in my life that have been lifelines in the last 2-year process of coming forward with my story. I'd like to first give thanks to Daryl Bach, the DTS staff, and the Hendricks Center for making today possible, for inviting this important and very serious conversation about abuse in the church to be happening. It's much needed. I'd like to thank Dr. Jim Bedell, a therapist, and Rob Spate, Both of these men have been investigative bloggers who have been critical to the process in my story, and I'd like to thank them for coming and being here today. I'd like to thank Mitch Little, who has been a friend, an elder, a pastor, and a legal resource for me. And I'd like to thank the Grace team. Two of their legal team are here today, Krissa and Amy. Amy, thank you for being here, and thank you for being a support system for me, along with Boz Tavigian, in this process. It has taken a village. I was tasked with telling everything that I've learned in the last 2 years in about 15 to 20 minutes, so I'm going to do my best to start with that. And I'm going to attempt to touch on the high points. 3 years ago, I thought Me Too was just a hashtag. And honestly, when Silence is Not Spiritual came across my email, I knew many of these women were my friends. And I thought, this is really not that big of a deal, to be honest with you. And so I did. I thought Me Too was just a hashtag. It was just a creation of social media. And in my naivete, I thought, what is the big deal? And within months, I came to learn more about the insidious nature of abuse and small steps of trust that were involved in grooming in my own experience. And in 2017, Me Too became a reckoning with the truth about my former pastor, friend, mentor, leader, and close family friend. Elie Wiesel, who is a Nobel laureate and a Holocaust survivor, said, "I swore to never be silent when human beings endure suffering. In humiliation, we must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere." So one night in a hotel room in Sweden in February of 1998, my former pastor, Bill Hybels, called me up to his room to discuss leadership, which was a common thing. He offered me wine, career advancement, and then detailed what he liked about my personality, my leadership, my body in great detail. And then he told me my husband was not my caliber and kissed me. That night, I remember getting to the door and holding onto the doorknob. I could feel myself coming apart at the seams. And I heard the voice of the Holy Spirit say, "Get out of this room. And if you don't, you will be destroyed." I got out into the hallway and I crumbled into the floor weeping and went back to my room and silently went to bed with my roommate in the bed next to me. That night, I listened to the voice of the Holy Spirit. I refused his advances and confronted him the next morning. I warned him not to do it again. Shortly afterward, I told my husband and my mom, "You tell your mother these things, right?" And so I told my husband and my mother and a handful of close friends, two of whom were sitting elders at Willow Creek at the time. I did what I was taught to do. I confronted him. I followed Matthew 18. And I assumed it was a lapse of judgment and believed the best. I believed that these were weak moments in the life of a man that I otherwise trusted and respected at the time. I also believed I was doing the right thing, the kind of thing a true friend would do when I called a meeting with him in the year, it was around 2001, and told him that I noticed a particular sexual type of energy from him whenever he was around 5 specific women, 2 of them being Nancy Beach and Nancy Ortberg, and I warned him to knock it off. He said that he understood. We sat in silence. I remember what I was wearing, and I remember sweating through my shirt as I left his office that day. But before I left and sat there in his office, I looked over at the doorway of his office to his former assistant's desks, and I randomly asked him, "Whatever happened to Pat Baranowski?" His assistant of 6 years, who had just seemed to have disappeared. And he said, "Oh, she's crazy." She stalked me. Within a year of that confrontation, I was exiled to the same windowless office Pat Baranowski had been placed in 10 years prior, before being fired. All three of these women mentioned later became an important part of my Me Too, Church Too story. The reckoning with truth began when I received a letter in a pink envelope from my friend and former elder, Betty Schmidt, in May of 2017, letting me know that there had been an investigation reopened into Bill Hybel's sexual conduct with multiple women, and that she had remembered my story of how Bill had kissed me in Sweden. Over time, I learned the details of other women's allegations and realized that many odd encounters, phrases, notes in code, tactics, invitations to be alone for leadership discussions, and the seeming lapses in character were actually 40-year patterns of perpetration upon many women. And that in reality, I had been intentionally groomed, perpetrated, and then discarded when I got too close to the truth. I was not the only one. It happened to me, too. In 2017, I discovered that my former pastor was still pursuing a woman who was young enough to be my daughter. As a mother of two teenage girls, I imagined what I would do if this were happening to them. And the mother bear in me came out, and I thought, I have to stand in the gap. I knew that I had a choice to make. I did not want to come forward. I did not want to be the one to speak. But for the sake of the purity and the integrity of the church that I love, and for the protection of past and future women who might potentially be victimized, I soon realized that I would need to have courage to speak up, even if it meant losing everything. Some days, it feels as though I almost have. Coming forward was the hardest, most challenging, painful, life-altering decision I have ever had to make. What it has cost me is immeasurable. I had no idea that the church that I loved would not believe me and the 9 other women as claims mounted. I had no idea that the church would continue to believe the pastor in question, even though years of allegations had been swirling and brought to their attention with no action taken. I did not imagine they would assassinate my character publicly. I was naive and could not imagine being persecuted, slandered, lied about, and continually bullied by the church on a global scale for reasons I may never fully know. I did not know how crushing it would be to come forward and the effects this would have on my marriage, my family, my health, my friendships, and my work. I did not imagine that I would be standing here today to confront widespread clergy abuse in the church. You know, it takes so much for a person to come forward. And, you know, today we are specifically talking about women coming forward, but in the last 2 years, I probably received 2 to 3 stories that come to me each week. And friends, it is not just women. It is our children. It is our daughters and our sons. It is men. It is boys who grow up to be men. And it is women. It is happening at alarming rates. The stories would lead me to believe this. The chance that a person is lying about an accusation of sexual harassment and or sexual abuse is very small. Most reports state that only 2 to 8% of those claims are even false. In my case, the odds that 10 women who have similar accusations of sexual misconduct and abuse by the same person, following the same patterns, in 4 successive decades, all falsely accusing the man, would be virtually statistically impossible. Today, we are asking what the church should do when allegations of sexual misconduct arise. We must also ask ourselves, why is sexual misconduct by pastors and church leaders happening in the first place? I've been recently reading 1 Timothy, and weeping through most of it on most days, because Paul constantly and consistently calls leaders in the church to live lives above reproach, to be faithful in their marriages, to be self-controlled and respectable, to set an example for other believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. And he also calls churches to publicly reprove and reprimand leaders who sin. When it's a viable accusation brought by 2 or 3 witnesses, to serve as a warning. This is a warning not only to the person who is perpetrating, it's a warning to perpetrators in the church, it's a warning to those being perpetrated, and it's a warning to those who are naive about the fact that it is even going on in their midst. Maybe the reason this is happening on such a massive level in the church, both in the evangelical and in the Catholic Church, is because the church has failed in its biblical responsibility to call out sin and to hold leaders to the high standard of behaviors that Jesus requires by the power of his Holy Spirit dwelling inside of them. In light of this, what can we do in our churches to handle this right? These are just a few things that I want to share with you coming directly from my experience. Take the allegations of sexual misconduct seriously. Whether it's misconduct, whether it is full abuse, it is ruinous to the lives of the people that it happens to. Create a safe and protected place for the person to share their story in an environment where there is a person in authority who's able to act upon the next steps that are needed in a neutral fashion. A vast majority of the time, the accuser is telling the truth. That said, do not try to handle the allegations internally. As you can see in our situation, the church was unwilling to agree to a formal neutral investigation since 2014. And so what happened as a result is many, many processes of internal investigation with investigators that were hired by the organization itself to protect the organization were leading those internal investigations. And then when our allegations became public, then we were publicly asked to conciliate through an association of evangelical leaders first, and then again by the new elder team at Willow Creek. None of them got to the source of the problem. Do a thorough and independent, neutral, outside investigation. Do not attempt to handle it internally and thereby further victimize those making claims. Third, do not attempt to make any initial private or public statements about the innocence of the perpetrator in question. The nuances of abuse are highly complex and hidden. It is the full intention of predators to create safeguards in place to keep their actions hidden so that they cannot be traced or brought to light. Then, once the truth is discovered, tell the congregation about what happened and resist the temptation to spin it or protect the reputation of your church and the offending leader. If the spiritual leader has sinned, call it what it is and call it out publicly. If you have mishandled an allegation and have wounded a victim of clergy abuse, do everything in your power to make a true apology and to make amends. If the harm was done publicly, apologize publicly and specifically for how you harmed that person and what you did to harm them. Then do whatever you can to make things right with the victim of the abuse. Care for them. Help them find healing and personal restoration, and make restitution if it's appropriate. Lastly, if statistics are correct, there are probably leaders in this room struggling with some form of addiction. If you are a leader struggling with patterns of abuse, addiction, pornography, deceit, I beg you to come out of hiding. I beg you to let therapists and churches love you and help you recover the wreckage that you are causing in your own life and the lives of those that you are wounding. If you read my social media, you can see it gets pretty wiry on there. But it has been a desire from day one that I lift up the truth, that I keep lifting up the truth in the power of Christ and not engage in bullying that I have received, both online and personally. So that said, I will continue to advocate for the survivors. I will continue to advocate for the purity of the gospel lived out among us. I will continue to advocate for the integrity of leaders in the church, for them to live and lead by the Spirit and not by patterns of their broken and false selves. To the church, I want to say, we can do better. We must do better. Our responsibility as leaders is to love the bride of Christ and present her to Jesus without blemish, stain, or wounding. I cannot unsee and unknow what I have learned in the last 2 years about systemic abuse in the evangelical churches of our American civilized society. This is our horror. We must address it. We must confess it. We must denounce the actions of leaders who perpetrate it. We must not tolerate it. We must model the character of Christ as we deal with it. We must hold hard things in tension. We must bring healing to the broken with merciful justice. We must not be silent any longer. Thank you.
This is the first opportunity I've had to speak about this publicly, so I want to thank Daryl Bach and DTS for inviting us to speak today. I also want to recognize and thank Kyle and Cindy Henderson, who are here from First Baptist Church in Athens, and Kyle has been the model for us of what a true and real apology is. And their church went through an extensive process of looking at the facts and looking at the truth and recognizing what had really happened, and they took incredible steps, very meaningful steps to Vonda and I to publicly apologize and own their piece of it. And so I'm grateful that you guys and your team are here. First, I want to say that my wife is a hero. Vonda is a hero because on a night in Sweden in 1998, she chose to honor our marriage vows. She chose me over a powerful, charismatic leader who was offering her the world. When you get married to someone, you hope beyond hope that they will stay true to the promises they make to you, to be faithful to you, to never leave either physically or emotionally. Vonda and I had a phrase for it, and have a phrase for it, I'm not going anywhere. We would say to each other often, and we meant it, or I hoped that she did. And that night in Bill Hybel's hotel room, she proved it to me. She proved it to God. She said no to Bill. She proved her character, and she proved that she meant what she said when she said, I do. And Vonda is a hero because she has come forward now. She spoke out because others would not or could not, out of understandable fear that they would be judged, minimized, harassed, vilified, and further abused and victimized, exactly the things that I have watched people do to my wife. Vonda stood up to help the church realize that women must be seen as valuable, cherished daughters of God who are not to be mistreated in any way. She chose to tell the truth about the sexual misconduct of a powerful, intimidating man for the sake of other women whom she believed were in danger, women she didn't even know, at great risk to her reputation and her future, and that is heroic. I've been asked to give the perspective of a spouse of an accuser. I've walked with Vonda every step of the way, but even she would tell you that she felt alone during much of this experience. There's no way to adequately describe the weight that has been on her shoulders, and she has had to bear that on her own. She's carried it bravely, but it has come at a great cost. What nobody usually talks about in abuse situations is that there are always more than the two parties involved. Everyone is affected. The families, the congregations. And there are two stages of abuse that happen when a church or ministry organization mishandles allegations and further victimizes the accusers. First, you have to deal with the abuse itself. In our case, Bill Hybels directly undermined our marriage by attempting to diminish me several times in the eyes of my wife. He told her I was not her caliber, as she mentioned. He called me a B player on another occasion and told her that she was an A player. He invited her up to his hotel room in Switzerland at yet another time for a leadership talk and told her to leave me in our room. The implication there was that she was a leader and that I wasn't, which at Willow Creek was about the worst thing you could say about someone. Vonda and I have recently had long conversations about how through the years those comments that Bill spoke to her may have negatively impacted our marriage. It was a direct attack on our intimacy. Then there is the fact that he kissed my wife and tried to seduce her. My pastor did that. It was a direct attack on our marriage, and that fact is particularly hard to process or to recover from. Trying to deal with the actual abuse is difficult enough, but then there was the fallout of the way that the church handled it and the Global Leadership Network. They defended Bill. They believed him and called my wife a liar in front of the church we loved and had given our lives to help build. And then they told the entire global church community that she was a liar. My wife, who has done nothing but love and serve and sacrifice herself for the church and live her life with the utmost integrity, had a cloud of suspicion placed over her that was incredibly unfair, unwarranted, untrue, and unkind. And by connection, that cloud was placed over me as well. I had to watch people from Willow Creek, the church I came to Christ in, as a 17-year-old guy, many of whom we know and would have considered friends. They blasted my wife on social media. They attacked her. They called her names. They told her they hoped she would die. And they wished calamity over our family. I watched my 15-year-old daughter, Delaney, struggle with deep loneliness, feeling like we were mostly absent during her entire sophomore year of high school because dealing with the fallout was like a full-time job for both of us as soon as we got home every night, answering emails and phone calls and writing blog posts and just trying to deal with all of it. I watched Vonda break her back to try and find time for both of our girls, to be present for them in the midst of the most difficult season of her life. And I watched Vonda deal with exhaustion and deep waves of sadness, despair, and hopelessness. But I also got to see God work through her, to defend the defenseless, spending hours on the phone counseling so many other women who told their stories, their heartbreaking stories of clergy abuse, and then beautifully walking the difficult line publicly between being a godly, frank truth teller and an advocate for the purity of the church while still being kind and respectful. I've watched God show up time and time again when things seem bleakest, to prompt someone to write something or say something or show up in some other way to apologize, to stand for Vonda and the others. My encouragement to you as fellow church leaders is to consider everyone affected by these accusations, not just the parties directly involved, and to take pains to care for them as well. Handle accusations with honesty and transparency and, above all, love, which means you will put the needs of the people involved and their families above your need to protect the reputation of your organization. Let me say that again. What love means is that you will put the needs of the people involved and their families above your need to protect the reputation of your organization. And recognize that if you mishandle these situations and move towards self-protection instead of love, the collateral damage can be immense. So why is so much of this coming out now in the church? In my opinion, Jesus is clearly doing a cleansing work in his church. And just as he cleansed the temple of the money changers with righteous anger, he is fiercely ridding his church of the things that are poisoning her from the inside out. I believe he is fighting for the beauty and protection of the church, whom he deeply loves and gave himself for. For the pastors out there who are even now abusing their authority and harming people under their care, they should be unnoticed. The Lion of Judah is on the move. He will defend his bride, and their time is coming. And out of compassion, I'm a little more angry about it. But But I agree with Vonda, and I would plead with you, if you are one of those pastors, if you are in this room or you are hearing my voice somehow and you are one of those pastors that is abusing people in any way, stop what you're doing now. Confess for the sake of the people you're hurting, for the sake of your family, for the sake of your church, for the sake of Christ. Let me close by speaking as a lead pastor in a church to other men. Can we as men and as church leaders honor and defend and protect and stand up for women? Can we stop objectifying them, even in subtle ways? We do it all the time. Can we stop? Can we take seriously Paul's exhortation to those of us in leadership to live lives of integrity and purity? And can we heed the call of Jesus to let go of our need to exercise our power? Can we humble ourselves, and can we serve our sisters instead of ourselves? Church, may it be so. Thank you.